There are nights when the silence after a prayer feels heavier than any answer could, nights when someone has spoken their deepest need into the dark and heard nothing return, not even the faint echo of being heard. A person who has lived inside that silence for months or years knows the particular weight of it, the way it presses on the chest differently than ordinary quiet, the way it begins to feel less like waiting and more like being forgotten. The prayers were sincere. The desire was real. The longing was not casual or fleeting. It was the kind that reaches all the way down to the foundation of who a person believes themselves to be. And still, the outer world stayed exactly the same, unmoved by the asking, indifferent to the tears, unchanged by the consistency of the devotion that kept showing up day after day. That silence does something to a person over time. It does not just test the faith. It slowly begins to reshape the story they tell themselves about whether they are the kind of person whose prayers get answered at all. What if the silence was never indifference? And what if the answer it carried was simply one that required a completely different level of readiness to actually hear? The teachings of Neville Goddard approach this question from a direction that most spiritual traditions never quite reach, and what they reveal is not comfortable at first, but it is extraordinarily liberating once it lands at the right depth. God, as Neville Goddard understood and taught, does not respond to the words of a prayer. God responds to the state of consciousness from which the prayer is being spoken. Not the sincerity of the asking. Not the persistence of the effort. Not the eloquence of the language. The state, the deep, quiet, often unconscious assumption about what is real and what is possible for the person doing the asking. That distinction changes everything, because it means that the silence was never a verdict on the worthiness of the prayer. It was always a precise reflection of the interior world from which the prayer emerged. How many people have spent years speaking the right words into the wrong state, wondering why the outer world refused to move in response to requests that felt so urgent and so genuine? This is the gap that most spiritual frameworks never address directly. The gap between the surface of a desire and the deeper layer of assumption that either allows the desire to form into reality or quietly, consistently cancels it before it can take shape. The surface of the desire says, I want this, I need this, I am asking for this with everything I have. The deeper layer of assumption says something else entirely, something that was installed long before the person had any conscious awareness of what was being written into the architecture of their inner world. And it is that deeper layer, not the surface, that consciousness reads when it is deciding what to reflect back into the visible world as experience. Is it possible that the most faithful thing the universe ever did was refuse to confirm a story about the self that was never actually true? That question lands differently once a person begins to sit with it honestly, because it suggests that what felt like abandonment may have been, all along, a form of the deepest possible protection. The lessons learned from reading the teachings of Neville Goddard point in exactly this direction. The silence was not the universe withholding, it was consciousness holding the space open, waiting for the assumed identity to expand enough to include the reality that was being asked for. This is not a comfortable teaching, because it asks a person to look not at the circumstances that seemed unmoved by their prayers, but at the state they were carrying in the moments between the prayers, in the ordinary hours when no spiritual practice was happening and the default assumption was running the show. That default assumption, quiet, invisible, rarely examined, is the actual prayer that consciousness has always been answering, and understanding this is the beginning of the most important shift a human being can make. What changes when the silence is no longer read as rejection but as the most honest mirror that has ever existed? One that reflects not what is wanted but what is genuinely assumed to be true at the deepest level of the self. Everything changes, and nothing changes all at once, but the relationship to the silence itself transforms in a way that makes all further transformation possible. A person who once stood before that silence feeling small and overlooked begins to stand before it with a different kind of attention, not the attention of someone waiting to be answered, but the attention of someone beginning to understand that they were always the one doing the answering. Neville Goddard spent a lifetime trying to bring people to this exact recognition, that the creative intelligence behind all of reality is not somewhere above the silence, listening and deciding. It is the very awareness inside the person who is praying, always creating, always reflecting, always responding to what it finds at the center of the one who is asking. And the moment that recognition becomes more than a concept, the moment it settles into the body as a lived reality rather than an interesting idea, the silence that was once a source of grief becomes the most sacred space a person has ever stood inside. There is a specific kind of spiritual exhaustion that does not come from lack of effort. It comes from enormous effort applied in the wrong direction for a very long time. Someone who has journaled every morning, visualized every night, spoken every affirmation with as much feeling as they could summon, and still watched the same reality return unchanged, knows this exhaustion from the inside. It is not laziness that produces this kind of tiredness. It is the particular fatigue of a person who has been working extraordinarily hard at the surface of a problem whose root lives somewhere much deeper. Most approaches to spiritual practice address the visible layer, the words, the rituals, the consistency of the technique, while the invisible layer of assumption beneath all of that continues to operate exactly as it always has. The teachings of Neville Goddard are precise about this. No technique, regardless of how correctly it is applied, can substitute for a genuine shift in the assumed state of being from which that technique is being practiced. What is the actual difference between a person who desires something deeply and a person who lives as though that thing is already quietly, naturally, undeniably real? That question cuts through every spiritual framework and every self-help method, because the answer has nothing to do with discipline, consistency, or the quality of the visualization. It has everything to do with assumption. An assumption is not a thought that is consciously chosen in a moment of focused intention. It is the automatic, background conviction that shapes how every experience is interpreted before the conscious mind even has a chance to respond. It operates like the root system of a tree that no one ever sees, invisible beneath the surface, never discussed, never examined, but determining the shape of every branch, every leaf, every direction the tree will grow before a single piece of fruit ever appears. Changing the leaves, adjusting the affirmations, refining the visualizations, improving the ritual, without ever reaching the root assumption is an act of tremendous effort that produces almost no lasting result. Have most people spent years, or even decades, working tirelessly to change the fruit of their lives without ever once touching the root from which every fruit has always grown? The lessons learned from reading the teachings of Neville Goddard reveal that the root is always an identity statement, always some version of I am followed by a deep, unexamined conviction about what is possible, what is deserved, and what is real for a person like this. I am someone whose prayers go unanswered. I am someone who tries and falls short. I am someone who watches others receive what they asked for while the silence returns, again and again, to the same address. These are not dramatic declarations spoken in moments of crisis. They are barely conscious conclusions, carried like stones in the center of the chest, shaping every request before it is even fully formed. And the silence that returns after each prayer is not the universe ignoring the asking. It is consciousness faithfully, precisely, and without judgment returning those exact conclusions to the person who holds them. Bruce Lipton, through decades of research into cellular biology and the mechanics of the subconscious mind, found something that aligns with extraordinary precision with what Neville Goddard taught from the inside of consciousness itself. The subconscious mind, Lipton discovered, operates like a program running on autopilot, filtering, interpreting, and creating experience according to beliefs that were installed long before the conscious mind developed the capacity to question or choose them. This is not metaphor. The cells of the body literally respond to the emotional and mental environment they inhabit, and that environment is shaped almost entirely by what is assumed to be true at the deepest level of the self. When someone prays from a genuine state of lack, the body is already living the full experience of lack, and the intelligence of consciousness, whatever name it is given, responds to that state, not to the statement being spoken above it. This is why two people can repeat the same affirmation and have entirely different outcomes. The words were identical, but the assumed reality operating beneath those words was completely, fundamentally different. What would it mean to stop crafting the perfect spiritual practice and instead begin honestly examining the assumption that is quietly running beneath every practice that has ever been attempted? That examination is not comfortable, because it requires a person to look at the places where the deepest layer of the self still insists that the desired reality is not truly available. Not yet, not here, not for someone carrying this particular history. But that discomfort is precisely where the real work begins. Not the work of adding more technique to an already exhausted practice, but the work of reaching beneath all technique to the layer where identity lives and where every creation has always originated. Neville Goddard described the shift from that layer as something that cannot be forced but can be chosen, a decision, made in the quiet interior of consciousness, to stop identifying with the story of waiting and to begin inhabiting, however gently at first, the story of having already arrived. And in that inhabiting, not performed for the outer world, not maintained through effort, but simply allowed as the natural resting place of awareness, something begins to move in the invisible architecture of reality that no amount of surface-level technique could ever have reached. There is a moment that arrives in the interior life of a person when the old way of seeking finally exhausts itself, not with drama or thunder, but quietly, the way a fire goes out when it simply has no more wood left to consume. Something in the constant reaching stops, and in that stopping, a different quality of awareness begins to surface, one that was always present but could never be heard above the noise of the relentless asking. It is in that particular stillness, the stillness that follows the exhaustion of effort rather than the stillness that precedes it, that the real teaching begins to land with a weight it never had when the mind was too busy searching to receive it. The silence that once pressed on the chest like absence begins to feel, in those rare and fragile moments of genuine interior quiet, less like a wall and more like an opening, a space that is not empty but full of something that was always waiting to be recognized. And it is precisely in that opening, in that moment when the grasping finally loosens, that the most important reorientation of consciousness becomes not just possible but almost inevitable. What if every stretch of silence was not a measurement of how little God cares, but a precise reflection of how fully the assumed identity still needed to shift before the desired reality could take visible form? The intelligence behind creation, as the teachings of Neville Goddard describe it, is not a distant authority sitting above human experience and deciding who deserves what based on the quality of their devotion. It is the very substance of awareness itself, responsive, faithful, and utterly without preference, always moving toward whatever state it finds itself genuinely inhabiting, always giving form to whatever is assumed to be real at the deepest layer of the self. When the state is fear wearing the costume of hope, creation reflects fear. When the state is longing dressed in the language of prayer, creation reflects longing. But when the state is the quiet, interior certainty of someone who has already arrived, not because the world confirmed it, but because consciousness claimed it, creation has no choice but to begin reflecting that arrival in the details of the visible world. The Book of Psalms, chapter 46, verse 10, carries a line that has been spoken in places of worship for centuries, heard by millions of people, and yet understood by very few at the level where it actually changes everything. Be still. These two words alone contain an entire instruction that has almost nothing to do with physical quietness and everything to do with the cessation of the internal movement of grasping, doubting, and demanding that reality provide evidence before assumption is allowed to take root. And no, not hope, not ask, not beg, not wait, no, which in the language of consciousness means to inhabit a reality with the same casual, unquestioned certainty that a person brings to the knowledge of their own name. That I am God. Not that God is a force located somewhere above the silence, measuring worthiness from a distance, but that the very I am within the person, that core, irreducible awareness that says, I exist, before any other thought forms, is itself the creative intelligence that Neville Goddard spent an entire lifetime trying to help people recognize as their own deepest nature. Every word of this verse is a complete map, and the map leads not outward toward a distant power but inward toward the awareness that was always already present, always already creating, always already the answer to every question it was simultaneously asking. This single verse, read through the understanding that the lessons of Neville Goddard make available, dismantles an entire architecture of spiritual seeking that was built on the assumption that the answer lies somewhere outside the one who is searching for it. The stillness being described is not the absence of movement in the body, it is the absence of doubt in the deepest layer of assumption, the cessation of the internal argument that insists the desired reality is not yet real, not yet arrived, not yet truly available. When someone becomes still at that level, not just physically quiet but genuinely settled in the interior place where assumption operates, the silence of God stops being silence in any meaningful sense at all. It becomes the most active force in existence, a creative power that was always present, always responding, always faithful, waiting only for the state of the one asking to align with the state of the thing being asked for. The answer was never withheld. It was always already formed in consciousness, held like a seed that contains the full architecture of the tree, needing only the exact interior climate that would allow it to cross from the invisible world into the visible one. Is it possible that the prayers which seemed to disappear into silence were actually being answered with perfect accuracy, answered not by giving what the words requested, but by reflecting back exactly what the assumed state of the one speaking was ready to receive? That question does not arrive as an accusation. It arrives as an invitation to look more honestly at the interior world that was running beneath every spiritual practice, beneath every sincere and desperate asking. Because if the answer to that question is yes, and the teachings of Neville Goddard, along with everything that Bruce Lipton's research confirms about the subconscious architecture of human experience, suggests that it is, then the entire relationship with silence, with prayer, and with the creative power of consciousness shifts in a way that cannot be undone. The silence was not the problem. The assumed identity operating beneath the prayer was the only thing that ever stood between the person asking and the reality they were asking for. And the recognition of that truth, not as a guilt-producing verdict but as the most empowering discovery available to a human being, is the exact point at which the silence stops being something suffered and begins being something understood. There is a particular kind of grief that arrives not from loss itself, but from the realization that the suffering was never caused by fate, by divine indifference, or by the arbitrary cruelty of circumstance, but by a story about the self that was accepted as truth long before there was any awareness to question it. That realization lands differently for different people. For some it arrives as immediate liberation, a door thrown open in a room that had been sealed for years. For others it arrives as something that resembles guilt, a quiet and heavy voice asking how much time was spent living inside the wrong assumption. But the teachings of Neville Goddard are careful here, because this truth was never designed to become another instrument of self-judgment or another reason to feel that something was fundamentally broken. Understanding that consciousness creates reality is not an invitation to blame the self for every difficulty that was ever experienced. It is an invitation to recognize the extraordinary creative power that was always present, even in the years when it was being used without any awareness of what it was doing. The person who spent years praying from a state of lack was not failing and was not being ignored. They were simply operating from a level of awareness that had not yet expanded to include the deeper mechanics of how creation actually functions. What shifts in a person the moment they genuinely understand, not as a concept held in the mind, but as a recognition felt in the body, that they were never powerless, only unaware of where the power actually lived. Everything shifts, and the shift begins not in the circumstances, but in the relationship to the circumstances, which is where every real transformation has always had its true origin. A person who once stood before silence feeling small and overlooked begins to stand before that same silence with a completely different quality of interior presence. No longer the presence of someone waiting to be chosen, but the presence of someone who has begun to understand that the choosing was always an inside movement. This is what Neville Goddard meant when he spoke about the difference between prayer and assumption. The prayer asks from a position of distance, the assumption claims from a position of identity, and only the assumption carries the creative weight that actually shifts the fabric of what becomes visible. The asking was never wrong. It was simply incomplete, reaching the door of desire but never quite crossing into the territory of inhabited truth, never quite making the interior movement from wanting to being. Is it possible that the distance between the desired reality and the present experience has never been a distance in time or in worthiness, but only a distance in the depth of the assumed state from which life was being lived? Most people have been conditioned to believe that the gap between what is wanted and what is real is filled by effort, by patience, or by the accumulation of enough spiritual practice to eventually tip some invisible scale in their favor. But the lessons learned from reading the teachings of Neville Goddard point to something entirely different. The gap is not filled by adding more. It is closed by a single interior movement that drops beneath the surface of desire into the layer where assumption lives and where the thing desired is simply, quietly claimed as already real. That movement is not a technique and it is not a discipline. It is a willingness, and the willingness is available in any moment, regardless of how long the silence has lasted or how unchanged the outer circumstances appear to be. The only thing that was ever required was the genuine interior decision to stop identifying with the story of the person who waits, and to begin inhabiting, however tentatively, however quietly at first, the story of the person for whom what is desired is simply, naturally, already the truth. The outer world has never been the cause of the inner state. It has always been the effect, the faithful and precise printout of whatever assumption has been operating at the deepest level of consciousness, often without the person's knowledge or consent. This is the teaching that changes the direction of everything, because it means that no circumstance, no matter how long it has persisted, has the power to determine what consciousness is capable of assuming next. A person can be standing in the middle of the exact opposite of everything they desire, and the creative power available to them in that moment is completely undiminished, because that power does not live in the circumstances, it lives in the state, and the state can shift independently of any outer evidence. Neville Goddard described this as the most natural and available movement in human experience, as simple and as radical as changing one's clothes, reaching past the familiar garment of the old identity and choosing, with full interior awareness, to wear the one that belongs to the person who already lives inside the desired reality. And in the wearing of that identity, not as performance, not as wishful thinking, but as the genuine, quiet assumption of someone who has decided that the inner truth does not need outer permission to be real, the creative force of consciousness begins doing the only work that has ever produced lasting change. What would it look like to bring that assumed identity not just into the dedicated moments of spiritual practice but into the unremarkable, ordinary hours of the day, into the way a cup of coffee is held, into the quality of attention brought to a conversation, into the feeling carried into sleep? Those moments are not separate from the creative process. They are the creative process, because consciousness does not take breaks, and the assumption that runs through the ordinary hours is the assumption that shapes the reality that appears in the days that follow. This is what makes the teaching of Neville Goddard simultaneously simple and demanding. Simple because the creative tool is always already present inside every person reading these words, and demanding because using it requires a consistency of interior inhabiting that goes far beyond any scheduled practice. The silence was never waiting for the prayer to become more eloquent or more consistent. It was waiting for the assumed identity to become more inhabited, more honest, more willing to live, as though the truth of consciousness was already enough to make the desired reality not just possible but inevitable. And that willingness, chosen not once in a moment of inspiration but again and again in the small and unobserved moments of ordinary life, is the substance of which every genuine transformation has always, without exception, been made. There is a man whose story requires no name, only the recognition that his experience belongs to far more people than just himself. He had spent 2 years trying to change a financial reality that seemed to have a will of its own, returning to the same ceiling no matter what he built beneath it, shrinking back to the same familiar shape no matter how hard he pushed against its edges. He had tried the gratitude practices, the scripting, the acting as if, and each time the outer world would shift slightly before settling back into the same configuration, as though reality had an elastic memory that always pulled the present back toward the assumed past. One afternoon, sitting in the same circumstances he had been trying to escape for 24 months, he stopped trying to change the outer picture and instead turned his attention, for the first time with genuine honesty, to the feeling he was carrying beneath all the practice, and what he found there was not confidence or faith but a deep, quiet, unexamined conviction that someone like him simply did not belong to the reality he was asking for. That was the root. Not the circumstances. Not the economy. Not the timing. The assumed identity of someone who was always reaching for something that lived just slightly beyond the boundary of what was really available to a person with his history. What changes the moment a person stops trying to fix the outer picture and begins, honestly and without self-judgment, to examine the interior assumption from which the outer picture has always been drawn? Everything becomes available that was unavailable before, not because the outer world suddenly cooperates, but because the creative force of consciousness finally has access to the layer where the actual work of transformation takes place. The lessons learned from reading the teachings of Neville Goddard are relentless on this point. The outer world does not need to change first. It cannot change first. It is always and only the interior state that moves, and the outer world follows, not as reward but as reflection. That man did not find a new technique or a better practice. He found the place inside himself where the old assumption was still running, and he made the decision, quietly and without fanfare, to inhabit a different identity with the same naturalness he had been inhabiting the limiting one. Within months, not because he worked harder but because he assumed differently, the ceiling that had held for 2 years simply stopped being a ceiling, not because the world changed its mind about him, but because he changed his assumption about himself. This is what genuine manifestation looks like when it is understood through the lens that the teachings of Neville Goddard provide. Not a dramatic intervention from outside, but a quiet, decisive interior movement that shifts the frequency from which an entire life is experienced. The outer world is not the enemy of transformation, and it is not the ally. It is the mirror, and the mirror's only function is to reflect with absolute precision whatever assumption is genuinely inhabiting the awareness that stands before it. Problems that once felt like permanent walls begin to reveal themselves as information, not punishments delivered by a universe that has chosen to withhold, but signals pointing directly to the assumption that still needs to shift before the desired reality can find its form. And in that reframe, something happens that no external success could have produced. The person stops being a subject of their circumstances and becomes the author of them, which is simultaneously the most terrifying and the most liberating recognition available to a human being standing inside an ordinary life. The terror comes from the removal of every excuse, and the liberation comes from the removal of every limitation, and both arrive in the same moment, in the same recognition, as the two inseparable faces of the same awakening. How would the experience of daily life change for someone who genuinely understood that every moment of ordinary existence, every unremarkable hour, every quiet evening, every morning before a single conscious intention has been set, is already a creative act, already shaping the reality that is forming just beyond the edge of what is currently visible? That understanding does not produce anxiety in the person who has truly received it. It produces a kind of alert, attentive calm, the quality of presence that belongs to someone who knows that what they carry inside them matters in a way that nothing outside of them can match. Neville Goddard described the feeling of the wish fulfilled not as an emotional peak to be manufactured through effort, but as a natural state to be inhabited through surrender. The surrender of the argument with present reality, and the quiet acceptance of the assumed reality as the one that consciousness chooses to call home. What reaches the deepest layer of creative consciousness is not the argument but the feeling, and the feeling, once genuinely and consistently inhabited, begins doing work that no repetition of words or accumulation of practice hours could ever accomplish on its own. This is why the silence that once felt like God's absence was always, at its deepest level, an invitation to stop seeking the confirmation from the outer world that only the inner world has ever had the authority to give. Is it possible that every experience of silence, every unanswered prayer, every unchanged circumstance was not evidence of a closed door but a precise and faithful pointing toward the one interior movement that would open everything? That possibility, once genuinely considered, changes the entire emotional landscape of the spiritual journey, because it transforms every apparent failure into a direction, every silence into a signal, and every unchanged circumstance into a question rather than a verdict. The real prayer has never been spoken in the moments of dedicated devotion. It has been lived in the texture of the ordinary hours, in the felt sense of identity that runs beneath every conscious thought, in the quiet assumption that answers the question of who this person is before any outer evidence arrives to confirm or contradict it. And the creative force of consciousness, whatever name it is given, in whatever tradition it is recognized, has always been answering that real prayer with a fidelity and a precision that the surface level of spiritual practice could never quite account for, because it was always listening at a depth that the surface level could never quite reach. The answer was never in the sky. It was never in the silence beyond the prayer. It was always in the state, the lived, embodied, quietly assumed state of the one who was asking, and it was always, without exception, being reflected back with the exactness of a mirror that has never once looked away. There is something that happens to a person the moment they truly grasp, not as an idea held carefully in the mind, but as a recognition that settles into the body like the release of a breath that has been held for years, that they have never been separate from the creative force they were praying to. It does not arrive gently for everyone, because what it carries beneath its surface is a weight that comfort-seeking spirituality tends to quietly avoid. If consciousness is the creator, then every reality that was ever experienced was, at some level, shaped by a state that was being held inside. For some people that recognition arrives as immediate liberation, a room flooded with light after years of navigating in the dark. For others it arrives with a wave of something that resembles disorientation, the feeling of the ground shifting beneath a map that was trusted for a very long time. But what lives on the other side of that disorientation, once the initial resistance passes and the mind stops arguing with the implications, is something that cannot be unrecognized or set aside, a sovereign creative authority that no outer circumstance, no silence, and no history of unanswered prayer has the power to diminish or take away. This is not a spiritual belief to be held at arm's length until there is enough evidence to commit to it. It is a living recognition that restructures the entire relationship between a person and the life they are moving through, from the inside out. What does it mean to carry that recognition into the most ordinary moments, into the disagreements that arrive without warning, into the waiting rooms of life where nothing seems to be moving, into the days when the old silence returns and the familiar pull of the old assumption begins to whisper that nothing has really changed? It means understanding that the silence in those moments is not a setback and not a sign that the interior shift was insufficient. It is simply neutral space, and the only question that ever matters in neutral space is what state is being brought to it in that particular moment. The teachings of Neville Goddard describe this with a precision that most spiritual frameworks never achieve. The world is a mirror, completely without preference, completely without the capacity to reward virtue or punish doubt. It simply reflects, with absolute and unwavering fidelity, whatever is genuinely assumed to be real by the awareness that stands before it. A person who brings the weight of unexamined grief to that mirror will see grief find new forms in the outer world. A person who brings the quiet, grounded certainty of someone who has already arrived will find arrival slowly, inevitably, and sometimes surprisingly beginning to crystallize in the details of ordinary life. The interval between the interior shift and the exterior reflection is not God's silence returning. It is simply the natural time between a seed being placed in fertile ground and the first visible emergence of what was always already growing in the dark beneath the surface. What would it feel like to live inside that interval, not with the anxiety of someone checking the ground every hour for signs of growth, but with the ease of someone who planted something real and trusts, without needing to supervise, that what was planted is already doing exactly what it was always designed to do? That quality of trust is not passive. It is one of the most active interior states available to a human being, because it requires the continuous, conscious choice to hold the assumed reality steady against the pull of outer evidence that has not yet caught up. This is precisely where most people abandon the process, not because the teaching failed and not because the practice was wrong, but because the old assumption returns wearing the costume of realism, whispering that what has not yet appeared in the physical world must not truly be real. The lessons learned from reading the teachings of Neville Goddard return to this exact point with a consistency that begins to feel like a kind of mercy. Treating the absence of outer confirmation as evidence of failure is like digging up a seed every few days to verify whether it has begun to grow. The act of checking is itself the act of undoing. The seed does not need supervision, and it does not need encouragement. It needs only the right interior conditions, and those conditions are entirely available to any person in any moment. The warmth of a genuinely assumed truth, held with enough steadiness that the frost of recurring doubt cannot reach the root. There is something the ocean offers here that no amount of instruction could replace. A single image that contains more truth than many pages of careful explanation. A wave does not negotiate with the ocean about whether it has earned the right to rise. It simply rises, because rising is what happens when the conditions are present, and at no point in the rising or the falling is the wave anything other than the ocean itself, temporarily taking a particular shape. A person who has genuinely received the I Am teaching at the center of everything Neville Goddard wrote begins to relate to the creative force of consciousness in exactly this way. Not as a petitioner addressing an external power and hoping for a favorable response, but as the very movement of that power, temporarily inhabiting the shape of a human life and a human story. The prayers that once dissolved into silence begin to transform into something quieter and more fundamental, a kind of interior knowing that does not need to be spoken aloud because it has already been claimed, already been inhabited, already woven into the fabric of the assumed self at the level where all creation originates. And that knowing, held in the body like warmth rather than carried in the mind like an argument that needs to be won, is the closest thing to what every wisdom tradition, in every language and every era, has ever meant when it described genuine, unshakable, creative faith. How different would the experience of spiritual seeking become for someone who stopped measuring the distance between where they are and where they want to be, and started measuring only the depth of the assumed state from which they are currently living? That shift in measurement changes everything, because distance can feel enormous and depth is always available, always adjustable, always entirely within the reach of the awareness that is already present and already alive in this exact moment. The creative work that the teachings of Neville Goddard point toward is not the work of building a longer bridge between the present and the desired reality. It is the work of recognizing that the bridge was never the structure needed, because the assumed self and the desired reality were never as far apart as the outer picture suggested. What creates the appearance of distance is not circumstance and not time. It is the gap between the depth of the desire and the depth of the assumption, and that gap closes not through effort but through the willingness to let the assumed truth be as real and as present as the desire itself. And in that closing, quiet, interior, requiring no outer witness and no outer confirmation, the silence that was once the heaviest burden of the spiritual journey becomes the most sacred space a person has ever stood inside, full not of absence but of a presence so complete that it needed no words to announce itself. Everything explored here now arrives at the place where understanding must become action. There is a practice Neville Goddard returned to throughout his entire teaching life. Not because it required perfect conditions or elaborate preparation to work, but because it was available to anyone, in any moment, without outer permission. The practice here is verbal, and its power lives not in the words themselves. It lives in the depth of the state from which those words are allowed to rise. Simplicity is not a limitation here, it is the entire point of the practice. It begins with stillness, not the stillness of waiting, but of having arrived. Allowing the eyes to close, allowing the breath to slow without being forced. Allowing something in the chest to release the familiar grip of argument. From that place, the words are not wishes directed outward toward the sky. They are recognitions spoken inward, the way a person states their own name. I am the one for whom this is already real. I am already home. These words are held, returned to, breathed into, until effort becomes ease. The measure of the practice is not whether strong emotion was produced. It is whether a small, real relaxation occurs somewhere in the body. The particular relaxation of someone who has set down a weight they forgot they carried. That quality of release is the signal that the state has genuinely shifted. Not shifted in performance, shifted in the actual architecture of assumption. What follows will not announce itself with drama or with sudden outer change. Consciousness always does its deepest work in the quiet, not in the loud. If something here has changed the relationship to silence even slightly, if the understanding of how consciousness creates has moved closer to center, then passing this to someone still carrying the grief of unanswered prayer may be the most generous act available in this particular moment. Choosing to remain close to these teachings is never a small decision. Every return is another layer of assumption quietly, permanently shifting. Staying here is not about collecting ideas, it is about becoming them. What would tomorrow's first ordinary moment look like, entered not from waiting, but from the inhabited certainty of someone who already knows their own nature? That question is the most practical one available, because the answer to it, lived in the smallest unremarkable choices of an ordinary day, builds everything. The lessons learned reading the teachings of Neville Goddard point here always. The seeker and the sought were never two things, they were always one awareness. And God's silence was simply that awareness, waiting to recognize itself.